Okay, good evening, all. Good Chodesh. I suppose some of us must have a very, perhaps a strange sense of humor. Shenichnas Adar Marbim Besimcha. We're meant to be, as Adar enters, we're meant to increase our simcha. And I don't know what it says about us that we have chosen, what it says about me or what it says about you, that we've chosen to spend some time together as Chodesh Adar enters. Interestingly, it actually only occurred to me this afternoon, we are going to celebrate a Yom Tov of Purim that seems to almost revel in the lack of cognition. Ad de lo yoda, we are meant to enter a state, and it needs obviously very careful and clear understanding and explanation, where we are meant to enter a state of somewhat not being able to yoda. Das is the ability to discern, to differentiate, to distinguish between different things. And we are spending the first few hours of Adar discussing free will and philosophy. Surely the two could not be more opposite, but I don't know whether time will permit this evening, but actually they of course are connected. If somebody does not have the ability to utilize their da'as at all, then it's no big deal if they get inebriated and they lose it, so to speak. To a Jew, da'as is always incredibly important. You graciously grant us the ability to discern between that which is true and that which isn't, between oir lechoshech, between Yisrael la'amim, between what is kodesh and chol. And interestingly, actually, therefore, what we're going to be doing this evening, let me set out the stall. As always, a disclaimer: I am not a philosopher, and I have dabbled a little bit. I have read, I have interested myself in trying to understand and keep to some extent abreast of modern trends in the wider world that we inhabit. And therefore, last week, part one was neuroscience. Again, just a very brief and basic introduction to some of the key ideas, perhaps. And this week, we're going to be looking at what the secular philosophers have said and sort of continue to say about this conundrum. Interestingly, in all philosophy courses, it's always called the free will problem. And we will look at the trends again. And I really want to stress at the beginning, I'm making chas v'shalom, no arrogant claims. I am not a philosopher, and I do not, I've not studied it widely and deeply. I have read and cherry-picked and coming at it very firmly from the Beis HaMedrash, with peering into that world with a curiosity. Chochma be'umois ta'amin. Chazal tell us that if somebody tells you there is wisdom amongst the nations, you should believe it. There is chokhmah. Of course there is, and it is at some level important for us to be cognizant of the broader trends. And then in the final session, which will be the week after Purim, because next week in Mitzvah Hashem will be a pre-Purim Shir, we will then again scratch the surface and begin to look at how the Torah views this very, very important, probably one of the most, if not one of the most fundamental axioms, the idea of free will, because that is the very expression of the godliness that is within us, in that we are Tselem Elokim. And what does it mean? And what are its parameters? And again, we will, in a single session, just sketch out the very basics. Having said that, that was the introduction. Los Gates. So, here we go. Yeah. So, so I've taken almost at random, not quite. These are both best-selling authors. The one on the left, published by Harvard University Press. The one on the right, far more probably, if you know anything about this, you will recognize Sam Harris as one of the foremost of the so-called new atheists, the proponents of new atheism. And he is very firmly of the belief, as we shall see, that free will is an illusion, and it's been killed, it's dead, it doesn't exist. And then he begins to deal with the aftermath of that, because that's also important. He wrote an interesting book called The Moral Tribes, because there are consequences. And that's even before we get to debating and discussing what it is and what the parameters are. So there are very clearly two very different views, and they both are available in popular scientific press. You will come across all these sort of things. And this is very interesting. I decided to include this, and I'll tell you why I decided to include this. This is on the inside of the dust jacket of this book by Sam Harris. And in contrast, and I really should have perhaps, I can't even remember if I did, but in contrast to the other, Haskomos, the approbations from other luminaries on the back of the book, as one often finds. You pick up a book in a bookshop and you want to see, well, who's given it a Haskoma? If somebody else that you know and recognize says it's the best thing since sliced bread, then you're very likely to buy it. And there are a number of others. Some of them affirmed atheists as well, but their language is very, very different to this one. And it's really interesting. Jerry Coyne, we mentioned him in last week's share, if you recall. Jerry Coyne, professor of ecology and evolution at the University of Chicago, author of Why Evolution is True. Just listen to, let's just read his comments on the book, his Haskoma. Free will is an illusion so convincing that people simply refuse to believe that we don't have it. In Free Will, Sam Harris combines neuroscience and psychology to lay this illusion to rest at last. Like all of Harris's books, this one will not only unsettle you, but make you think deeply. Read it. You have no choice. Okay, that's, classic sting in the tail type of humor, which the new atheists use. Really, really interesting. If you watch them and you read them, the cynicism and the sarcasm, which is actually really quite interesting, is very much a trademark quality. That's if you watch and read Krauss and others, and you'll see very, very much. But here, what he's done is fascinating. Unlike the others on the back of the book, who the eminent atheists in their own rights, and they basically say, read this book. He's got some amazing ideas. Look at what he says. This is very definitive. Free will is an illusion, so convincing. And that Sam Harris in this book, he lays the illusion to rest at last. This is the end. I mean, what he's saying is, after you've read this book, it's all over. Game over. There's nothing more to say. Psychology, neurology, sociology, nothing. Game over. This is it. Sam Harris has nailed the last, nail into the coffin of free will, and it's all over. Which actually is just simply not an accurate representation of the broader academic community. So it's very polemic. It's very polemical. So I just found that really, really interesting. Here we have a quote from Sam. How can we be free as conscious agents if everything that we consciously intend is caused by events in our brain that we do not intend and of which we are entirely unaware? We can't. And here he's conflated various different neural processes, higher cognitive thinking, lower cognitive thinking. Of course, there are things in our brain that happen the whole time on autopilot, and there's been a lot of fascinating studies on that. I have not included them tonight. If anybody's interested, you can ask me afterwards. Millet and others have done a lot of work on that. Nobody's suggesting, of course, that there aren't unconscious processes that go on the whole time that we don't need to devote serious neural resources to. But he is saying this we cannot be free as conscious agents because everything that we consciously intend is caused. And this is where we're beginning to probably unpick the first problem. And now one of the words we're going to encounter a lot this evening, of course, is determinism. To what extent is, I'll be very broad, to what extent is everything determined or predetermined, the concept of determinism? And this is what he is This is the idea that he's going along with, and we will investigate this in a little bit more detail shortly. Let's move on. So, determinism and atheism. Here we have Sam Harris again. He declared that free will is nothing but an illusion and wishful thinking. And Jerry Coyne, who we quoted before, said, I'm starting to realize there are striking parallels between belief in God and belief in free will. There is no evidence for the existence of either, and plenty of evidence against both. Belief in both makes people feel better. Now, this is an interesting idea, and it is true. We have demonstrated, I showed you a little bit of evidence last week, and there is plenty more to show that people who believe in free will, whether or not free will exists, but people who believe in free will make better moral choices. They are generally more honest. It seems to do something positive for people. Now, maybe that's not a reason, that's not evidence as for whether it does or doesn't exist, obviously, but it has definitely positive benefits for society, so much so that there's a minority view. There's a professor in Haifa, I forget his name now, it'll come back to me, who is a proponent of something he calls illusionism, which means in his mind, he says he accepts, in his view, there is no such a thing as free will. And this, of course, creates the big problem, which we will touch on a little, which is therefore that people cannot be held accountable for their actions. And this has consequences for our legal system. And here we immediately have some sort of schizophrenia in our societal outlook and the institutions upon which our societies, Western democracies, are based. If we assume, and there is growing proponents of the view that in essence there is very little free will, and criminals and others who are conditioned, nature and nurture, we're not even going to go into that, their genes, plus their environment and all the things that happen to them, push them and propel them down a certain path. And therefore there is very little, if any, culpability. We therefore need to move, but yet we have court systems. And therefore there is the assumption, and we lock people up. And no civilized society doesn't do that. But then it does change very much the basis upon which we do it, the reason upon which we do it. And it's no longer a judgmental thing, quite literally. Nor is it even necessarily rehabilitative. It is merely that it's just something we got to do, because if you go around and you murder somebody, it might not be your fault. It's in your genes, it's in your whatever it is. But it's dangerous for society. So we just got to get rid of it. We lock you away for a bit. But it's a whole different way of looking at things, and we will look at some of the evidence for that as well. And I couldn't go by without quoting Christopher Hitchens, and it's actually not quite his quote. It does come from a little bit earlier. I forget who exactly, but it does come from earlier. But he says, of course, we have free will because we have no choice but to have it. And actually, it could be there's a double entendre there, because acknowledging that without free will, or if without what he would call the illusion of free will, then there's no culpability, there's no responsibility. A society that believes in free will is, by and large, a more ordered society. Voltaire, one of my favorite Voltaire quotes, he says, consenting disbelief in God between adults in private is one thing, but I should want my wife, my valet, my tailor, my servant to believe in God, for I believe I shall be cheated less and robbed less. So that was a very utilitarian, I suppose, sort of argument for the belief of God. But let's leave them aside, and let's go to Albert Einstein. And he says, Einstein says, I'm a determinist. As such, I do not believe in free will. Practically, I am nevertheless compelled to act as if freedom of the will existed. If I wish to live in a civilized community, I must act as if man is a responsible being. That's an astounding admission, very honest one, but it's an astounding admission. And bearing in mind that many eminent philosophers and scientists, and I think it's probably almost true to say the preponderance of the scientific and philosophical community or lean very much towards these ideas. And yet the notion of goodness, and again, we won't tackle this tonight really, but the notion of goodness and morality and right and wrong is yet still something that they cling on to and do believe in. But so it's a whole different way of thinking. And why it's important for us is because for us as Jews, and I suppose I can't let the whole night go without any Torah at all. It's apropos of Ve'ele hamishpatim asher tosim lifneim, this week's Sedra, where we deal so much with interpersonal, the rules and the regulations of the interpersonal and social responsibility, but we see it within the context of coming from Sinai, meaning that we are endowed with the capacity to understand that certain things are right and wrong. And that is because God intuitively gave us this brain which intuitively feels that certain things are right and wrong. Can we absolutely prove it? If you're an atheist, no, you can't. But our whole approach is we're coming at it from a whole different place, and in a very ironic twist. In our world, man is very much center stage, but not like the Greeks. It's the exact opposite. It comes from a place of humility and a cognizance of being a divine being, and therefore having a responsibility to live up to that, rather than I'm at the apex of the universe and everybody has to worship me. It's in both systems, man is front and center stage, but coming at it from a totally different perspective. And that's just a short comment. Oh, this didn't come out very well. I do apologize. This is a quote from Francis Crick. I should have checked this one. The text is all wrong. He basically says, I mean, you can see just from the bottom, I'm sorry, he says, as Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. And this fits, by the way, with the other quote that we had from him last week on infanticide, if you recall. Oh, I can see some of it now. Your joys and your sorrows, your memories and your ambitions, your sense of personal identity and free will are in fact no more than the behavior of a vast assembly of nerve cells and their associated molecules. As Lewis Carroll's Alice might have phrased it, you're nothing but a pack of neurons. And of course, this is in line with the reductionist, materialist approach, which he so brilliantly helped to reveal to what to us is the gadlus of Hashem in the double helix of the DNA. But he drew, obviously, the exact opposite conclusion. Now, here's an interesting one. Some of you might recognize one of the most famous jurists of the 20th century, Clarence Darrow. And here's a quote, and then we're going to tell you a small story. Some of you might be familiar with it. It was, at the time, it was called the Trial of the Century, and it very tragically involved two upper class, rich Jewish kids. So here's a quote. There are a lot of myths that make the human race cruel and barbarous and unkind, good and evil, sin and crime, free will and the like, delusions made to excuse God for damning men and to excuse men for crucifying each other. Very eloquent, not something we would go along with, but he sets out his stall. These are myths. Good and evil, sin and crime, free will and the like are delusions. Now, where and how do we know, if you know anything about him, is in the following story. In the following case, the so-called Loeb and Leopold murder trial, 1924, I think it was. And essentially, they were children of millionaires in Chicago, Jewish children. That one father was a millionaire from manufacturing boxers, the other one from something else. They were brilliant. One of them was the youngest graduate in the University of Chicago. The other one, at the age of 18, I think, was already a noted ornithologist and a an expert on certain birds that he would lecture on. Highly intelligent and very full of themselves. And they set about in their boredom, and they set about and they kidnapped and they murdered a young man. They were caught. Eventually they confessed. And in those days, they would have got the death penalty. It was a sensational trial. It was known, you look at the newspaper accounts, trial of the century it was called. Clarence Darrow excelled, and he, in his closing arguments to the judge, he persuaded the boys to change their plea from not guilty to guilty, but he put his entire focus on sparing them hanging. And he, in a 12-hour peroration, in a defense speech, that, according to the newspaper accounts, occasionally was rambling, but it had its strong points. And one of his main points, which is why it interests us, was that in essence, these boys had no choice. They were bored, middle class, upper middle class, upper class children, highly intelligent, and they didn't even have a choice in the matter. That was essentially his. And let's read from part of his, this is part of his, the defense. Nature is strong and she is pitiless. She works in mysterious ways and we are her victims. We have not much to do with it ourselves. Nature takes this job in hand and we only play our parts. In the world of the old Omar Khayyam, we are only impotent pieces in the game he plays. Upon this checkerboard of nights and days, hither and thither, moves and checks and slays, and one by one back in the closet lays. What had this boy to do with it? He was not his own father. He was not his own mother. All of this was handed to him. He did not surround himself with governesses and wealth. He did not make himself, and yet he is to be compelled to pay. In pleading of that Leopold be spared, Darrow said, tell me that you can visit the wrath of fate and chance and life and eternity upon a 19-year-old boy. And was he successful? Yes and no. They did go to prison, but they did not get the death penalty. We move on to two other players, and I'm doing this backwards. I'm sort of coming from the modern era, and then we will move backwards a little bit. Two names that you should be aware of if you read anything about this. And the truth is, I should probably have mentioned them last week because they are more to do with the world of neuroscience. But there is an overlap, and Joshua Green has published on neurolaw, an Oxford handbook on neurolaw, and he continues to. He's a prolific publisher. You should read some of his stuff. So just to tell you who he is, he's an assistant professor of psychology at Harvard, director of the Moral Cognition Lab. He studies moral judgment and decision-making using neuroscientific and behavioral methods. He has a PhD in philosophy. So he's very much motivated by philosophical questions, but he is the one, by the way, Joshua Green is the one who had the idea of asking subjects about the famous trolley problem, which I'm not even sure I mentioned last week. I might have mentioned it, who would you kill the fat man? The famous Philippa Foot's trolley dilemma. And he had the idea of asking subjects the series of questions and the iterations, the loop and the, all the different iterations whilst being subject to fMRI, where you could then see very clearly the areas of the brain that were being lit up. So, and he was able to demonstrate scientifically and very clearly and very convincingly that when people thought they were thinking, in essence, they were feeling. So that's quite an achievement, by the way. And then his partner in a number of papers and books, but the paper which probably became the Citation Classic 2004, published in the Royal Society, which I'm going to show you an abstract of in a minute, just to tell you who he is. Jonathan Cohen he's a professor of psychology at Princeton, co-director of the Princeton Neuroscience Institute. So they've both got their credentials. They both would appear to be Jewish, not that that makes a difference, but so is Sam Harris. But here we go. Now, so this is just the abstract of the paper that was published by the Royal Society, arguably, if I may say so, as a Brit, the most prestigious Royal Society and the oldest, most venerable in the world. And this was this is the paper. You can get it online. You can download it and read it if you're interested. It's called "For the Law, Neuroscience Changes Nothing and Everything." And here's the abstract. Let's just quickly read through it. The rapidly growing field of cognitive neuroscience holds the promise of explaining the operations of the mind in terms of the physical operations of the brain. Let me just stop for a second and point out just one term in case you're not familiar with it, something called dualism. Dualism is an approach which seeks to separate, as the word would imply, dualism, dual, mind and brain, almost the physical from something that is not non-physical, and how they relate to each other. That's called dualism, and it has its adherents and those that don't like it. But it's important to be, if you're into this, it's important to be aware of that concept. So he mentions here that neuroscience holds the promise of explaining the operations of the mind in terms of the physical operation of the brain. You can see that. So they're very clearly a reductionist, a materialist, right? Some suggest that our emerging understanding of the physical causes of human misbehavior will have a transformative effect on the law. Others argue that new neuroscience will provide only new details and that existing legal doctrine can accommodate whatever new information neuroscience will provide. In other words, in simple English, a machloikas, whether revolutionary new levels of understanding of neuroscience and cognition, will it fundamentally change the concepts upon which our legal system is based? Or will it just mean that we'll have to tinker at the edges and adapt somewhat? But the basic concepts of culpability and liability and agency and volition and cause will still apply. We argue, that's Joshua and Jonathan, we argue that neuroscience will probably have a transformative effect on the law, despite the fact that existing legal doctrine can in principle accommodate whatever neuroscience will tell us. This was written in 2004. Be interesting to read up, because a lot has happened in neuroscience since then, and be interesting to argue whether their prediction actually has come true or is in the process of coming true. I'm not at all convinced that it is, but let's see. So they say they are taking quite a strong stand, and they are saying that despite the fact that legal systems could withstand any new information neuroscience would tell us, and we wouldn't have to change it, but they argue it probably will. What would that mean? And this is really important because of the moral consequences that this is going to have. New neuroscience will change the law, not by undermining its current assumptions, but by transforming people's moral intuitions about free will and responsibility. This change in moral outlook will result not from the discovery of crucial new facts or clever new arguments, but from a new appreciation of old arguments, bolstered by vivid new illustrations provided by cognitive neuroscience. That's a very telling sentence. That is essentially to say that we are going to go back to Laplace and Newton, deterministic approaches, which will then be given some support, some additional support, a new appreciation of old arguments bolstered by some supportive evidence from neuroscience. We foresee and recommend a shift away from punishment aimed at retribution in favor of a more progressive, consequentialist approach to the criminal law. And that is an absolutely fascinating, because that is philosophy. Okay, he is a philosopher, but he's in the Department of Psychology. So this is taking some advances in neuroscience to argue for society to shift all of their attitudes away from being judgmental, punishment, retribution, because free will is a myth in the classic sense. And therefore, what it makes sense is a progressive consequentialist approach to the criminal law. In other words, this is, you did X, and again, time doesn't permit this evening to go into it in any depth, but you have to understand what consequentialism really means. If you are interested in pursuing this, the person I would recommend, probably more than anybody else, because he's very readable and very approachable, and he's just brought out a new book not all that long ago, is Michael Sandel. Two books I would recommend. The first one is justice, and the one that came out not that long ago, which is definitely worth reading, absolutely fascinating. It's called The Tyranny of Merit. He's got a lot of his lectures are online from Harvard philosophy department on YouTube, and I definitely recommend watching them. So that is absolutely fascinating. It's a nevuah, so to speak. It's I wouldn't say a prophecy, but they are foreseeing this. Has it happened? I don't think it's actually happened yet. Although society has split, and this has provided a basis, as we shall see. So let's get down to, let's get down to some of the basic ideas. So some of the ideas here are, of course, free will. Now, the truth is, one would really need to, we're not in any way beginning to do this justice. Anybody who studied philosophy in university will know this will be a semester, and you'll go through Hume and Locke and Kant and all this sort of stuff. There is so much more. I'm not even going to give Hume a mention tonight, which is probably a bit of a chutzpah, but we can't do this. This is just an absolute whistle-stop tour. And I'm more interested, if I'm honest, I'm more interested in how this informs and shapes society as where we are going. And then how does that, as a thinking Orthodox Jew, I just need to be aware of the world in which I am operating and its assumptions and the direction of travel that it is taking. So I know where I am. I just know what's happening around me. It then also, of course, enables, if one teaches Torah, one encounters Jews who are not so religious or more traditional or secular, then you can at least have an understanding, a slightly more sophisticated understanding of what is going on. Because if we are not able to appreciate the modern mindset, then we cannot teach Torah. We cannot disseminate Torah in the way that it needs to be. It's always the old, timeless truths. But it's all about the modern, the wrapping and the packaging. So let's look at some of the ideas very quickly. Free will. Again, when we say bechira, it is something very, very different to what is meant here by free will. But in its very basic notion, it's the ability to make free, unhindered choices. Then you have determinism. Determinism comes in two flavors. You've got you've got hard determinism, and then at the bottom you've got soft determinism. So what determinism is, the idea that all actions are governed by laws outside of our control. And we will explain in a little bit more detail shortly, show you some of the possibly scientific bases for that. It's the idea that all actions are governed by laws outside of our control. We are living in a world that is governed by the laws of cause and effect. And if we only were able, the way Laplace put it, if we're only able to, the problem is one of, in halacha, we would say, it's a chisoron yediyah. Take the weather system, for example. So the weather is a massively complex system that would appear to have chaos very much involved in it, the so-called chaos theory. There are massive differences between the micro and the macro level, but the laws are all there. The laws are all there. If one was only able to quantify, that's why the biggest supercomputers are used for for these weather patterns, to predicting weather patterns ahead, is only because of the variables, which are so many, so immense. But the concepts and the laws are all there. And if our brain is just a clump of neurons, and the laws that govern neurons are all there, we know what those laws are to a large extent, or at least in theory. If it were able for everybody to know everything, all the physical laws that would govern the universe, would that therefore mean, determinism says that we may not know them, but all actions are actually governed by laws. There are physical laws that govern all of them, and thus everything that happens and everything that we do, if we were able to crunch into some massive supercomputer, my genes, my history, my environment, the previous decisions, even though they weren't mine, and everything together, then you would be able to predict the outcome. And this is not the question of Hashem knowing what we're going to do. That's a whole different thing, because he's outside of the system, and we're not dealing with that question today. But in terms of, I have no choice, that's determinism says you have no free will. Hard determinism is the teaching that denies humanity has free will, and it believes that all actions have a prior cause. All actions have a prior cause. This is hard determinism. And there are philosophers that believe in this, and it therefore removes moral responsibility for actions, in essence. It's as simple as that. Libertarianism is what is called incompatibilism. This sounds very complicated. It isn't. It's very straightforward. Something is incompatible. We have two competing ideas. Incompatibilism tells me that determinism and free will clash so significantly that they cannot be reconciled in any way. There's no they are utterly and fundamentally incompatible. And at the risk of making a joke, it is Adar after all, you have to make a choice. Either there is free will or there is determinism. Libertarianism says this theory claims we are morally responsible for all of our actions and we are free to make choices. It totally denies determinism and goes down the route totally of free will. And then you have something somewhere in between called soft determinism or compatibilism. And this teaching says we can be both determined and free. As some of our moral choices are free, but aspects of our nature are determined. If push came to shove, I would probably argue that Judaism is probably closest to this one, to soft determinism, compatibilism, because hopefully when we talk about Bechira, we will realize that often when people talk about free will as if we have free will in everything, of course we do not. And we also will need to discuss the parameters and limitations of free will, according to most classic Torah sources, as relating to decision making, not necessarily relating to actions. We'll come to that in the next session. So it's sketched out here. This is from Wikipedia. I make no excuses. You can see it here, but I think I've explained it so we can move on because there is so much more to do. Now, why is this freedom, this free will so important? Here's the thing: we intuitively feel that we are free. We just have, can we prove it? Not necessarily, but if you ask people generally feel that they are free and that they are the originators of their own actions. Now, we need to feel free in order to be responsible for our actions. Our practices of praise and blame presuppose that we are free. It's built into society very strongly. And then you have what I've mentioned to you before, the Green Paper, Joshua Green, Neuroscience, Moral and Legal Responsibility and Theories of Punishment. Here, interesting, was a quote from Roper versus Simmons, 2005, US Supreme Court decision. It was unconstitutional to impose capital punishment for crimes committed under the age of 18. And this is the basis of it, the quote at the bottom. This is in 2005. Recent scientific advances in brain research indicate that the adolescent brain has not yet fully developed. The decision-making capacity and risk-taking behavior of adolescents are far different from those of adults. Thus, adolescent offenders are less culpable. Roper versus Simmons, the role of the science. Simmons, the role of the science brief. So maybe Joshua Green did get something right. Only a year later, the Supreme Court was prepared to acknowledge at least partially this concept. So let's look very briefly at some of the main actors here, because I don't want to go on too long. We have Laplace very famously, and I've cropped some of the quote. We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of its past and the cause of its future. And then he goes on to surmise that if one was able to have a mind that could take everything into account, to such a mind, nothing could be uncertain, and past and future alike would be present before its eyes. So then the question is, well, is physics deterministic? You have, I brought him in more to a little bit cheeky here, Epicurus, founder of atomic theory, one of the fascinating actors that has found its way into the English language as a mark of an accolade of sophistication. Somebody who has somebody is a gourmand and appreciates good food and wine, is sophisticated, is an Epicurean. And for us, of course, somebody that is lives only in the here and now and denies the reality and the validity of eternity is, of course, to us the worst epithet, and Epicurus, the same thing. So he wrote it interestingly. He says Democritus, who spoke about things being made up of their constituent parts, he turned a blind eye to himself. His actions contradicted his own doctrine. So he took Democritus to task. So we had, up until sort of up until the sort of the beginning to the middle of the last century, a lot of the philosophical and scientific progress was heading towards where we find ourselves today, which is the free will becoming on the ropes, so to speak. And then an interesting thing happened, and I'm only going to mention it, by the way, again. Obviously, I claim no great knowledge of this, but it's fascinating that now that we know that the fundamental laws of quantum physics are probabilistic, and that you cannot tell both the momentum and the location of certain subatomic particles at the same time, fundamentally they are, it's all in terms of probabilities, and Richard Feynman is probably the guy to read for these sort of things. So that actually has implications for Bechira. It keeps alive the idea that the observer observing something, a physical event, we now know, I mean, I don't claim to understand this, but I'm sure if you're on this Zoom, you're probably aware of these sort of things. So Young's two-slit experiment, or John Wheeler's conscious observer. We know that after an experiment has been done, depending on how it is observed, or whether it is observed, without even going into Schrodinger's cat, I suppose, you can even make a difference. The conscious observer can impact reality, not be on the receiving end, be of a deterministic universe, but kind of it's shifting a little bit. And that's it's important for us to realize that that potentially has implications for the concept of Bechira as well. So aspects of physics today are certainly accepted as not being deterministic. So are reductive materialism and dualistic spookiness our only options? Well, now let's begin to give a very briefly put things into a context, because it's really important for us to realize that science, any discipline, does not exist in a vacuum. It exists at a certain point in history, and it is informed by, as much as it shapes, it responds to. Dessler spoke about this in terms of and I suppose one needs to be clear, we're not talking about conspiracy theories here. We're talking about the fact that, let's say, Hashem, God was on trial in the 18th century, and therefore the stage was set for a way for science to write him out of the script, and that came about. Darwin complied, not consciously. He was a religious man in and of himself, but the stage was set. So it's a grave error to think that these things happen in a vacuum. They absolutely do not. So it's often said that the tendency of scientific thought in the past 500 years is more and more to undermine the special status of human beings, and that is largely true. We had Copernicus and Galileo, help, our planet isn't at the center of the universe. And then we have Darwin, help, we're descended from apes. And then we have Marx, help, we're controlled by economic forces. Freud, help, we're controlled by our subconscious. And responsibility is slowly being whittled away and taken away from us. But the truth is, there are parallel philosophical trends that have been reasserting our special status. And I'm not going to give you all the quotes, but we have Kant, we have Hegel, we have Wittgenstein, we have Frege, we have others. And therefore, just to sketch it out very briefly, according to post-Kantian philosophy, the truth of logic and mathematics do not depend on the nature of matter. So logical relations do not need to be explained in purely physical terms. Nothing capable of grasping logical relations can be explained in purely physical terms either. It therefore follows, if that is so, that human beings, according to that school of thought, can't be explained in purely physical terms. They don't need to posit what we do, which is the existence of something which is spiritual, a spiritual entity, a neshama, but they are able to grasp that there are different types, what they called, some called enabling conditions, things that make something's existence possible, as opposed to constitutive conditions, those that determine something's identity. I'll give you, so for example, what composition or temperature, etc., are needed to keep a shape as a cube? Well, the compositions and the temperature, that's a question for physicists and chemists, because that is a question about enabling conditions. And what properties must a thing have to count as being a cube? That's a question for geometers, because that's a question about constitutive conditions. And if I was being really technical, I suppose the latter would probably be ontology. That's really, I suppose, what it means. So therefore, at least according, again, in Judaism, we wouldn't go along with everything here, but at least according to post-Kantian philosophy, the dualists are partly right. The mind cannot be explained in purely material terms. And the materialists are also partly right, perhaps, to explain the mind. You don't need to posit a non-material component. We do, but the door is open, it means. So mental phenomena are not non-material enabling conditions in addition to the mind's material enabling conditions, but the mental phenomena are constitutive conditions. So how does that help us with free will? So here is, and with this we'll probably sort of wrap up this quick summary. How does this help us with free will? Creatures with minds are made of matter. We have minds and they're made of matter. Our physical properties have to be compatible with our mental properties. We operate out of this material thing. There's no question about that. But our physical properties do not have to explain our mental properties. They have to be compatible. Like physical law determines how likely the quantum events are. We don't make the enabling conditions more likely. We just make the enabling conditions happen. And in essence, that I think has just been a very quick whistle-stop tour of some modern trends, and we've really only paid lip service. And like I keep repeating, that this is just a very short introduction to some aspects. And if anybody's interested, I've got a bit of a reading list. If anybody's interested in taking any of these things a little bit further, because I personally do believe that this is something that is important for somebody who considers themselves to be part of the modern world whilst being a Torah true Jew. It is important, I believe, to keep yourself informed. Thank you for joining me. And next time we'll begin to scratch the surface of another aspect of it, which is the Torah. Okay, no problem. Thank you so much. Be well, everybody. Kol tov. Bye.